Imagine this. The United States, one of the largest agricultural producers in the world, is now depending on China, its biggest rival, to rescue American farmers. Yes, you heard that right. Former President Donald Trump, who once declared he would win the trade war with Beijing, is now pleading for China to purchase more U.S. farm goods. What was once painted as a bold strategy to protect American workers has spiraled into a crisis that has left many U.S. farmers struggling to survive. Crops are piling up, profits are shrinking, and families that have relied on farming for generations are facing one of the toughest financial squeezes in decades. This isn't just a story about soybeans, corn, or pork. It's about how global politics and hardline trade policies can directly hit the livelihoods of everyday Americans. The irony is striking. After years of tough talk about beating China, Trump's trade war has created a situation where America's own farmers need China more than ever. And that dependence may not just shape the future of U.S. agriculture, but also Washington's ability to stand firm against Beijing. So, how did we get here? And what comes next? Let's break it down. The U.S. China trade war began as a power struggle over tariffs, technology, and global dominance. Trump argued that China had taken unfair advantage of America for decades, stealing intellectual property and flooding the U.S. market with cheap goods. His solution? Slap tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports and force Beijing to play fair. On paper, it sounded tough. In practice, it sparked a tit-for-tat escalation that hit U.S. farmers square in the face. China responded by targeting America's agricultural exports, especially soybeans, which were a backbone of many farming states that had strongly supported Trump in 2016. Suddenly, U.S. farmers found their biggest overseas customer shutting its doors. Prices crashed, markets dried up, and Washington was forced to issue billions of dollars in emergency aid just to keep farms afloat. Fast forward to today, and the situation has only grown more desperate. With global supply chains shifting and competition from Brazil, Argentina, and other agricultural powerhouses, American farmers are losing ground. Even when China does agree to buy more U.S. products, it's often seen as a short-term political move rather than a lasting commitment. That uncertainty makes it nearly impossible for farmers to plan ahead. So why is this important now? Because the U.S. farm economy is at a crossroads. What happens with China in the coming months could decide whether American agriculture regains its strength or continues sliding toward long-term decline. Beyond that, the trade war shows us a much bigger picture. When world powers clash, ordinary workers often pay the heaviest price. Number 1. The broken promise of winning the trade. Or when Donald Trump launched the trade war against China, he promised Americans that the outcome would be quick, decisive, and overwhelmingly in America's favor. The phrase, "trade wars are easy to win," became one of his most famous declarations. For many Americans, especially those in farming communities, this sounded like a bold plan that would finally level the playing field. After years of complaints about China flooding U.S. markets with cheap goods and stealing American intellectual property, there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, Trump's hardline approach would change the game. But the reality turned out very different. Instead of forcing Beijing into submission, the trade war unleashed a cycle of retaliation that hurt the very people Trump claimed he was protecting. China immediately fired back with tariffs of its own, deliberately targeting American agricultural exports like soybeans, pork, and dairy products, industries deeply tied to Trump's rural base. The logic was simple: hit the U.S. where it hurts most politically. For farmers, the effect was devastating. Long-standing trade relationships with Chinese buyers, built up over decades, collapsed almost overnight. Contracts were canceled, shipments were left stranded, and markets that had once seemed stable evaporated in a matter of months. Farmers who had been told they would benefit from a better deal suddenly found themselves begging for short-term relief. The U.S. government rushed to create bailout packages worth tens of billions of dollars to keep farms afloat. But even those payments couldn't fully replace lost income or rebuild broken international trust. Many farmers described it as a temporary lifeline, not a solution. They couldn't plan long-term, couldn't predict future demand, and couldn't feel secure about their businesses. The idea of winning quickly looked more like losing ground. Instead of Beijing blinking first, it was American farmers who absorbed the shock. The Chinese market, once the single largest buyer of U.S. soybeans, shifted its focus to Brazil and other exporters. Even after partial trade deals were announced, the damage was done. China had proven it could live without U.S. agriculture, while American farmers realized just how fragile their economic security really was. What Trump framed as a bold act of strength turned into one of the costliest experiments in U.S. trade policy history. And for rural America, the promise of an easy win became a bitter reminder that global trade wars are rarely about quick victories. They're about long-term survival, and in this case, survival came with a heavy price. Number 2. Farmers. As political pawns, one of the most striking aspects of the U.S. China trade war was the way American farmers became pawns in a geopolitical chess game. From Beijing's perspective, hitting agriculture wasn't just about economics, it was about politics. China knew that Trump's electoral strength came from rural states like Iowa, Wisconsin, and Nebraska, where farming is not just an industry, but a way of life. By cutting off purchases of soybeans, corn, and pork, Beijing wasn't only squeezing the U.S. economy, it was putting direct pressure on Trump's most loyal supporters. This strategy worked with ruthless efficiency. Soybean prices dropped to their lowest levels in more than a decade. Storage silos filled with unsold crops, while families who had spent generations building farming operations suddenly found themselves drowning in uncertainty. Many farmers described the situation as feeling like collateral damage in a war they never asked for. They weren't international negotiators, but they were paying the price for every tariff, counter-tariff, and policy announcement made in Washington or Beijing. To soften the blow, the Trump administration rolled out massive aid packages totaling more than $28 billion over 2 years. On the surface, this sounded like support. But farmers quickly realized that government checks couldn't replace stable markets. Export relationships take years to build and seconds to break, and China's absence from the U.S. buyer list created gaps that no amount of bailout money could fill. Many farmers openly admitted that they didn't want handouts. They wanted trade. They wanted predictable long-term buyers, not unpredictable political battles dictating their income. What made the situation even more painful was the realization that farmers weren't just caught in an economic storm. They were being used as leverage in a larger geopolitical fight. China's retaliation was designed to send a message. If the U.S. wants to pressure us, we'll make sure your president feels the backlash where it matters most. And while Washington framed its bailouts as a patriotic shield, many rural Americans quietly wondered whether they had been sacrificed for political theater. Some farmers remained loyal, believing that short-term pain would lead to long-term gain. But others grew increasingly frustrated, questioning whether Trump's gamble had any real strategy behind it. What they saw was a cycle of promises and bailouts, but little evidence of lasting progress. In the end, America's farmers discovered that in a global trade war, they weren't just producers of food, they were bargaining chips. And when powerful nations use people as pawns, the damage often lingers long after the headlines fade. Number 3. China's leverage and the global shift. One of the most overlooked consequences of the trade war is how much leverage China gained in the global agricultural market. Before tariffs, China depended heavily on the United States for soybeans and other staple imports. American farmers were the go-to suppliers, and that dominance gave Washington at least some bargaining power. But once the trade war escalated, China had no choice but to diversify. And in doing so, it reduced America's influence in ways that may never fully be reversed. Beijing turned to Brazil as its main alternative, investing billions in South American infrastructure to secure stable supplies of soybeans. Brazil quickly ramped up production and exports, filling the gap left by the U.S. With every shipment, China built stronger ties with a new partner, while American farmers lost not just revenue, but trust. Once a buyer finds new suppliers, it's not easy to win them back. China also spread its purchases across Argentina, Russia, and even parts of Africa, effectively building a safety net. The message was clear. Beijing would never again allow itself to be so dependent on American farmers. And this shift created a dangerous imbalance. Now it's U.S. agriculture that relies on China's willingness to buy, not the other way around. If China decides to cut back tomorrow, American farmers feel the shock immediately, while Beijing has plenty of other options to cushion the blow. This growing dependency is more than an economic challenge. It's a strategic vulnerability. U.S. trade negotiators now enter discussions knowing that their farmers desperately need Chinese demand, while China can afford to walk away. That kind of asymmetry limits America's ability to apply pressure on broader issues like technology, human rights, or national security. The irony is hard to ignore. A trade war that was supposed to weaken China's position ended up making Beijing more resilient. By diversifying suppliers, China not only secured its food security, but also tightened its grip on the global agricultural market. Meanwhile, American farmers are left hoping for deals and purchases that may never match the stability of the pre-trade war era. This shift in leverage is a sobering reminder of how quickly global markets can realign. And for the U.S., it's a warning. Once you lose your role as a trusted supplier, getting it back is far harder than anyone expected. Number 4. The strain on rural America. For rural America, the trade war was more than a political or economic battle. It was personal. Farming has always been about more than business. It's about identity, tradition, and survival. Families pass land and skills down from generation to generation, and for decades, many believed farming was one of the few stable paths left in an uncertain economy. But the trade war shattered that sense of security, leaving behind deep financial and emotional scars. When China cut back on U.S. agricultural imports, farmers in states like Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota were left with unsold crops piling up in silos. Prices for soybeans and corn plunged, and what used to be predictable income streams suddenly became unpredictable gambles. Many farmers had taken out loans to finance equipment, seeds, and land, but when revenues dried up, debt became crushing. Bankruptcies in farm states surged, and younger farmers, who had just begun their careers, found themselves questioning whether agriculture had a future at all. The strain wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Farming is already one of the most stressful professions, with long hours, uncertain weather, and thin margins. The trade war magnified every worry. Calls to farm crisis hotlines increased, and mental health struggles became a silent epidemic across rural communities. For some, the feeling of being abandoned by leaders they trusted only added to the pain. They had supported Trump, believing he would fight for them, but instead felt like pawns sacrificed in a battle far above their heads. Government bailouts helped temporarily, but they also created resentment. Farmers didn't want handouts. They wanted markets. They wanted the dignity of selling their crops and feeding the world, not relying on subsidies to survive. Many described the aid as a band-aid on a bullet wound, a stopgap measure that couldn't repair the long-term damage. To trade relationships. Communities also felt the ripple effects. Local businesses that depend on farmers, from equipment dealers to grocery stores, saw sales drop. Schools and hospitals in rural areas, already under pressure, faced tighter budgets as farm incomes fell. The trade war didn't just hit individual farmers. It shook the entire rural economy. The strain revealed something important. America's farm belt is far more vulnerable than it appears. Despite its reputation for resilience, rural America can be destabilized quickly when global politics shift. The trade war was a harsh reminder that in an interconnected world, even the heartland is not insulated from the decisions made in Washington and Beijing. Number 5. The bigger geopolitical picture, at its core, the U.S. China trade war was never just about soybeans, corn, or tariffs. It was about something much bigger, the future balance of power in the global economy. Trump's gamble was designed to check China's rise, to remind Beijing that Washington still held the upper hand. But the results revealed something that American policymakers have been reluctant to admit. China has the ability to absorb pain, adjust its strategy, and even come out stronger on the other side. China used the trade war as a wake-up call. Rather than folding under U.S. pressure, Beijing doubled down on self-sufficiency. It invested heavily in its own agricultural technology, expanded domestic production, and diversified its imports. In other words, the trade war forced China to accelerate a long-term plan it had already been pursuing, reducing reliance on the United States. And while Washington thought tariffs would weaken Beijing, in many ways they sped up China's push to become less vulnerable to outside pressure. Meanwhile, the United States discovered something uncomfortable, even its strongest. Industries are not immune to retaliation. American agriculture has long been celebrated as the most productive and competitive in the world. But when Beijing closed its doors, it exposed how dependent farmers had become on one massive buyer. The image of U.S. strength collided with the reality of vulnerability. On a geopolitical level, this weakened America's negotiating position. If every move Washington makes risks hurting its own farmers more than China's economy, then Beijing gains leverage in other areas, from technology disputes to national security standoffs in the South China Sea. The agricultural struggle became a symbol of a larger truth. America cannot fight a prolonged economic war without collateral damage at home. The irony is striking. What was meant to contain China's rise may have actually expanded Beijing's influence. By proving it could weather U.S. pressure and find new global partners, China sent a message to the world. It is no longer dependent on America. And for many countries watching from the sidelines, this signaled a shift in global power dynamics. If the U.S. can't bend China with its economic might, what does that say about the future of American dominance? The trade war didn't just reshape the farm economy, it reshaped the perception of power. And in international politics, perception is often just as important as reality. The story of America's farmers caught in the U.S. China trade war is one of unintended consequences, painful ironies, and hard lessons. What began as a bold declaration that trade wars are easy to win evolved into a costly reminder that in a globalized world, there are no easy victories. Instead of forcing China to fold, the U.S. found itself pleading for Beijing to resume purchases, turning a show of strength into an uncomfortable dependence. For farmers, the fallout has been deeply personal. Entire communities were thrust into uncertainty, forced to watch as their livelihoods were used as bargaining chips in a battle far beyond their control. Decades of carefully built trade relationships were torn apart in months. Government bailouts kept many afloat, but they couldn't erase the damage to markets, trust, and stability. For families whose lives revolve around farming, it wasn't just about lost income. It was about dignity, identity, and the fear of losing everything they had worked for. For the United States as a whole, the trade war exposed vulnerabilities that many didn't realize existed. It revealed how much the country relies on China not just as a competitor, but as a customer. It showed that America's economic power is not limitless, and that rivals can strike back in ways that hit ordinary people where it hurts most. And it forced Washington to confront a sobering reality. Economic nationalism sounds powerful in speeches, but it can leave lasting scars when tested on the world stage. For China, the episode was a chance to demonstrate resilience and to speed up its shift toward global independence. By diversifying suppliers and strengthening ties with countries like Brazil, Beijing reduced its reliance on American agriculture, a shift that may never fully reverse. The trade war intended to weaken China's position. Instead, it highlighted how adaptable and strategic Beijing can be when pushed. So where does that leave us? The U.S. China rivalry is far from over. Farmers will continue to feel the pressure as trade negotiations, geopolitical tensions, and shifting markets reshape their future. The question is whether Washington will learn from this chapter by building a more resilient, diversified, agricultural strategy, or whether America's heartland will remain at the MENA.